Hi, welcome to another Global Resilience Summit conversation. And today I'm Fleet Maull, and today I'm here with uh, retired Lieutenant Richard Goerling. How you doing, Rich?
Good, Fleet. Great to be here with you.
Good to see you. So I want to tell our audience a little bit about you and your work. If they're readers of Mindful Magazine, they probably already know you. You were on the cover of Mindful Magazine a couple of years back. Um, uh, Lieutenant Goerling is a retired police lieutenant from the Hillsborough, Oregon Police Department, also a retired commander with the U.S. Coast Guard. And so combining the Coast Guard and your service as a police officer, how many years did you spend that's quite a span, right?
Yeah, 31 years
31 years altogether.
ish. Yeah.
Yeah, ish. Well, thank you for that more than 3 decades of service, and really want to acknowledge you for that. And so, what was kind of unique about you is I don't know, maybe you can tell us how you kind of found your way into mindfulness, and you trained in MBSR, and then you brought that to the Hillsborough Police Department. You started a program there that you developed called, I believe, mindfulness-based resiliency, and you were working not only with police but also fire and emergency, I think, and you were able to do some research. I think you're also on faculty with Pacific University there in Portland, Oregon, and you were able to do some research and publish some good research, and really kind of move the ball forward a bit in terms of mindfulness-based first responder resilience training. And you have your own consultancy called Mindful Badge, and you're a year into your retirement now, and you're out at least before the pandemic hit, and we're all on home confinement. But you've been out all over the country working with first responder agencies, bringing mindfulness and resilience to them. And we share that background, so we can go back and forth a little because I do a lot of similar work. But first, I want to just ask you, how have you been doing with during this time of the pandemic? How's it been for you personally?
Yeah, thanks, Fleet. That's a very kind introduction. I appreciate that. You know, the pandemic is really interesting. I really came to an all stop, a very fast stop to all of the work I was doing on the ground, and that was primarily my specialty, was doing work on the on the ground with people. Um, but you know, it's been kind of in a strange way. It's been a gift. It's been a gift to slow down. It's been a gift to spend more time with. I have two teenage daughters. We spend time with them and their mom, and just to sort of kind of be forced into some personal development, which is, really fantastic, which wasn't happening so much when I was on the road. And it's also an opportunity to kind of look at curriculum and do some curriculum development and revamping and all those things. So I am in close contact with a lot of first responders and supporting them in small ways, but it's pretty much individual ways. And a couple of times a week, I'm doing just a short meditation session online, much like what you're offering. So watching the world, watching the global suffering from this disease is, it's a whole another level of front and center reality. This huge reality check of this privilege that I think all of us, in the Western world have been living. So it's been a really interesting time of reevaluating a lot of things and looking at how do we support not just this narrow band of what we think of first responders, but frontline personnel in the work of working with human suffering. And that's beyond some of the traditional ways I think we look at that. So a whole lot of thinking and planning going on in my world right now. So.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm glad you've been able to have that time to do so. And it is like, I don't know, for myself, as we go through this day by day or week by week, I kind of, feel like I'm adapting here and doing this and trying to show up and kind of, but anytime I actually slow down and really stop, I realize, it's like all the cards have been thrown up in the air. We have no idea where they're going to land. I mean, it really is an experience of not knowing. And I appreciate my Zen training around not knowing and bearing witness, because we really are in a new world here. and there's a lot to do. I mean, there's immediate need, so it's very helpful to focus on that. But it's really hard to in any way predict where we're going to be 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now. The one thing for certain is people are going to need support, and also our first responders are going to need a lot of support. So I wonder if I could start with talking a little bit about, if you could share a little bit about first responder culture, because I think if someone's never been in law enforcement or other types of being a first responder or corrections that I'm very familiar with, it's hard to really understand what that culture is like on the inside. And on the one hand, and we've talked about this before, and I've heard you share this in trainings, there's the warrior ethos, and there's the shadow aspect of that and the healthy aspect of that. And there's also a tendency, first, my experience is when the need is there, first responders just show up and they put their lives on the line, their bodies on the line. But then in the background behind that, maybe because of the stress of the jobs and the trauma exposure of the jobs, the actual cultures tend to go negative, or can be quite negative, and maybe not so supportive and resilient like we might like them to be. And I think that's been a lot of your work. So I wonder if you could just help us understand a little bit about who first responders are and what their lives are like.
Yeah, it's a really deep conversation, Fleet, and one, I'm not going to pretend to be in a position where I can adequately describe who first responders are. I can, however, look at two bodies of knowledge. We can look at some data, and we can look at some lived experience, or some of the wisdom from that warrior journey. And I think, generally speaking, and first responder culture is going to vary from community to community, in different regions of the US and Canada, and the globe. And so there's no one size fits all, for sure. And even inside an organization, for example, like NYPD or LAPD or Atlanta Police or Seattle, PD, you're going to have this diverse group of personalities and subcultures and all of that. So, but here's what's important, I think, for folks to understand. Men and women choose to step into service as a first responder for all kinds of reasons, but without exception, there is a greater good motive, right? I chose to become a police officer because I wanted to serve the greater good. Now, I had some other motives in there too. It was interesting, it was exciting, and all that other stuff, but I'm not going to stay in it if I don't have this internal drive to show up and serve others, okay? And I think that's fundamentally this notion of warrior ethos that we identify. Now, when we start looking at the occupational stress and trauma, okay, we look at the just simple things like organizational stressors in any organization, and they're exacerbated, I think, in the first responder community because of the occupational stress outside the walls of the office, the precinct, fire station. We look at shift work, we look at again, organizational stressors, and we look at just the operational stress, right? And what we see is a really sorted data picture. And we look at the data, and there's a number of researchers in the United States and Canada and the UK and Australia and other places in the world that are looking at the occupational stress and trauma of the first responder and how that impacts them. And I think that we have this, as you mentioned earlier, the warrior ethos, and then the shadow side, that we have this, I think, this beautiful ethos of I want to serve others. And then the job happens. And then the human suffering happens. And then the bearing witness to human suffering, frankly, in most cases, without the necessary skills to do so and remain resilient. And then it begins to slowly erode that warrior ethos, that humanitarian ethos that says, I want to show up and serve others. And very quickly, and I say very quickly in big terms, maybe it takes years, the first responder often becomes injured. And it's a stress or trauma injury that we fight. And we fight it in all kinds of maladaptive ways. And we also maybe don't even see the injury. And so culture sometimes gets it adapts to that sort of the darkness of that injury. And the next thing you know, we're doing things like othering, and we're doing our best to serve others, but we have to find coping mechanisms. And we often find maladaptive coping mechanisms like dehumanizing people, not in a malicious way, but in a way that helps us to go, okay, I gotta, I've seen this car crash and I've seen dead bodies and this doesn't bother me anymore. We say that to ourselves and each other when it's absolutely not true, but we have to say it because we're not being resourced in other ways to be able to bear witness to that suffering and work through that trauma so that we can go to the next one. And so what happens is we pile on trauma experience after trauma experience, or said differently, trauma exposure after trauma exposure. And regularly that we see that in the data, it turns into injury. Now, what's really interesting right now is we're seeing John Violante out of Buffalo, New York at the university there has been studying police officer health and wellness for 25 years. And he recently published a paper that looked at the last 22 years of police officers' injuries and line of duty deaths. And one of the interesting trends that he's identified is that we're seeing a reduction historically in on-the-job physical injuries and line-of-duty deaths, whether they're felonious or accidental. But we're seeing an increase in deaths from job-related illness. So things like cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, diabetes. I mean, all these things, this metabolic syndrome phenomenon. And those are trauma injuries that brew very, very slowly. And so that's a whole lot of sort of nerd data to talk about the health of what we know, but that deeply impacts our capacity to have a healthy culture, whether we're a firefighter, a medic, or a police officer, or whatever it is, corrections officer. When all you see is human suffering, it's really hard to cultivate and sustain a healthy view of the world around you. And this is why this notion of resilience is so critical, because resilience isn't just physical resilience of, oh, I'm resilient, I can run fast and jump high. Resilience is I can bear witness to human suffering. I can skillfully apply my tradecraft in the middle of that human suffering. We call that trauma. And when I'm done, I have enough self-awareness and self-regulation and self-compassion that now I can make informed choices about what kind of interventions I need to move into recovery and healing. And if the stars align, post-traumatic growth.
I think it's so important for people to know that, and then as I've become more aware, my work has been primarily bringing these kind of skills to our incarcerated population for decades. And, but our organization, we always wanted to support correctional officers and other first responders. We just hadn't had the opportunity. We finally got the opportunity 12, 13 years ago, and it's a big part of my work today. And I started learning more about that world and learning about the really disturbing health statistics and all the really fairly severe health risks that are there for both physical, moral, trauma, injury due to accumulated insufficiently managed chronic stress and then continual both secondary and primary trauma exposure. And actually, tragically, what really opened the door to give us opportunities to begin doing that work was agencies that were experiencing a rash of suicides among their officers. And often when I've shared some of this information with people out in the general public, they're just astounded. They had no idea that our first responders are at such risk for physical illness and injury, early death because of chronic illness related, things like you mentioned, or even moral injury, moral distress, and the kind of psychological process that can lead to suicidality. So I think it's really important that people appreciate, what those people who are keeping the rest of us safe and serving that way, what the pressures are under. So can you talk a little bit about, what you've seen is possible in terms, and as you said, first responder cultures are very localized. I'm sure every police department's a little different, every agency. I know in the corrections world, every prison is different, both in terms of the inmate culture and the correctional officer culture. Everyone, they're very different. They have their own character. And there are similarities, but what have you seen that you've been able to help both individuals, become more resilient, so they're less negatively, or the health risks for them are not as severe. They're able to do their jobs maybe in different ways, or things that you've been able to do to actually shift the culture within a particular agency so that it becomes more resilient and encourages and incorporates more healthier ways of adapting, less maladaptive coping mechanisms.
Yeah, Fleet. What I want to talk about first is across the board, I have observed, and whether that's, trained with organizations, been inside of organizations myself as a first responder, or had close contact with them, and also read research. What I think is very fair to say is there is an underlying force within first responder culture that drives first responders towards maladaptive numbing. And so rather than, because we don't have open cultures where, hey, let's talk about how that made you feel. And I don't mean holding hands and sort of, singing songs and being sort of what we perceive as, hippy dippy. I mean, hey, dude, you just finished, you just came back from that traffic crash where there were 3 fatalities and 2 of them were children. That sucks, debrief that with me, right? Let's express some of the trauma that's there. Let's get it out. Let's name it. Let's put it out there. We're beginning to grow the skills to do that, but the culture basically says, no, I'm good. Hey, how you doing? I'm good. We even phrase our questions so that we give an easy out, because I'm not sure I really want to know how you're doing, Fleet. If we're first responders working together, we just finished a house fire, and we had to deal with some bodies we found in there. When we're all finished, I'm going to ask the question because I feel like it's the right thing to do, but I don't know that I have the emotional and physical and spiritual bandwidth to really hear the answer to your question, and neither do you. So we just kind of, okay, we agree silently to maladapt and just not talk about this. And we see this in behavior. We see this in the abuse of alcohol. We see this in policing. We see this in violence. And so these are fighting words for, all my friends in policing out there. But what we know is that misuse of alcohol makes us more violent. And I'm talking about domestic violence.
Yeah.
And then there's the awful but lawful force response we see in the field. We could talk about, well, it probably wasn't necessary to tase that person, but it sure was legal. And I did it because I'm dysregulated. Just frankly, they just pissed me off. And, I told them to do this. They didn't do it. Was there another way? Maybe, but we didn't explore that because we couldn't regulate. And again, those are fighting words. I get it. But we spend so much time just trying to be in the wake of occupational stress and trauma exposure, and maybe the injury that comes with that, in ways that do not serve us, right? And I'm not saying I don't like to use right or wrong or good or bad. I don't really know what that means. It doesn't help. But I like to look at, okay, are my behaviors serving me well? And one of the things that I think that the culture does is we have created systems that support maladaptive coping. And one of those systems results in just how we have conversations around trauma. And so if I'm inside of a first responder organization, I'm likely to go to, let's say we work together, we're cops, and I'm likely to go to you, Fleet, and say, hey, dude, you really need to get some help, right? Now, first of all, that's how we have conversations, right? It's like, hey, the implication is you're broken, and what I've just done is I've created a power differential, right? And I love Rachel Naomi Remen's work, out of her medical work with cancer patients and others who are suffering in San Francisco. This whole idea that when I'm trying to help you and fix you, I'm really not serving you, right? And so what I want to do is shift how we have conversations about trauma. And that begins with mindset. And so what we have, the system has created a mindset that is it's a fixed mindset that says, I have to avoid occupational stress and trauma. Okay, it says I have to armor up and try to avoid the trauma injury. And if I get trauma injured, then I'm broken. Then I'm less than, that I just wasn't strong enough to avoid it. And that's the culture, and it's universal. The problem with that, Fleet, is that the data doesn't support it, nor does the lived wisdom of the warrior support it. So we have this culture that says we need programs to fix police officers and firefighters and medics and nurses and doctors and, you know, inner city school teachers and whoever's exposed to lots of trauma occupationally. We don't need to fix anybody. And honestly, we don't need to help anybody. We need to resource people with the skills to transition to a growth mindset. And so the growth mindset is this, and notice my body language. Fixed mindset, I'm trying to avoid trauma. Growth mindset is, hey, I've chose this profession. I chose this profession because I'm a warrior humanitarian. And I'm stepping into this world because I want to serve others. And I know I will bear witness to human suffering. And I will train to be skillful in the middle of that suffering. And I know I'm going to be injured. I know based on the data and the wisdom of the lived experience that I will be injured probably multiple times over the course of my career. And even better, I know I can train for it. I can train skills in self-awareness and self-regulation and compassion to be able to make informed decisions about the necessary interventions to move into recovery and healing and growth. And so now I've basically framed things like integrated medicine and psychotherapy and social support and pursuit of spirit and awe, as I like to refer to it now, right? As interventions that are necessary to move into recovery. They're not, oh, you need help, you need fixing. No, we know I'm going to be injured, and I have already a plan of preventive work within those interventions and work in response to injury. So for example, I go to my integrated medicine doctor, physician's assistant, acupuncturist, you know, structural reintegrationist, whatever, on a regular basis because it's simply smart. The data supports it, right? Wisdom supports it. I also see my psychotherapist, or what I like to refer to as my mental health coach, my licensed mental health clinician. I see this person on a regular basis. Why? Because it's smart, it's preventive, and the data supports it. Is it because I'm weak or broken? No, it just makes sense, right? And similarly, I have social connections. I stay connected to my community. I have tribes that I stay closely connected to, right? And I also have this pursuit of spirit and awe. Maybe it's a faith practice, maybe it's not. Maybe it's going to the theater every month or going to the art museums or going hunting or fishing, but I'm pursuing things that bring me adventure and joy and allow me to see the beauty of humanity in the world around me. And so we're framing occupational stress and trauma with a growth mindset that absolutely shifts how we have conversations around trauma injury. So now, Fleet, with a growth mindset, you and I just got in an officer-involved shooting, let's say. So now I come to you and I say, dude, that was brutal. That was one of the worst radio calls I've ever been on, and I just feel really shitty, you know? And I know you're feeling something similar. So talk to me about the choices you're gonna make. What kind of decisions are you gonna make, Fleet, to move into recovery? Because here's what I'm gonna do, right? So it's no longer a, hey, dude, you weren't strong enough to make it through this without it bothering you, right? And now you need help. Now we're gonna send you to, you know, the broken down, you know, land of misfit toys with other psychiatrists and medical doctors who, you know, are gonna try to fix you. It just doesn't make sense to have that victim mindset around occupational stress and trauma. And what I've just outlined is the accumulation of really those 30 years of being in public safety in one way or the other, and the last 15 years of studying occupational stress and trauma. And it's also pretty offensive to the system. The system does not like what I just said. And we have people who've developed expertise around victim mindset inside public safety agencies, and they've been trained to believe what isn't serving us well. And what I'm asking is, well, let's shift this. So it's not only let's shift the mindset, now I have this cognitive idea, now I can change the world. How do we train skills that support a growth mindset? And I will tell you, Fleet, the only way I know how to do that is to teach skills of awareness and compassion. And it starts with mindfulness, and maybe it takes us down other paths, but mindfulness is the critical trauma skill that we must train to cultivate growth mindset and resilience for first responders, and really for anybody.
Wow, Richard. Well, I mean, you just covered a really beautiful multi-dimensional kind of modeling of what we need to do to be personally resilient. But I really love your distinction between the growth mindset and the victim mindset. And of course, people are victimized and people experience terrible things. But, and this is a whole nother subject I could get into. It could affect so many different dimensions of our culture. But, you know, that growth mindset is so empowering. And often the victim mindset, though understandable, it tends to create that, you know, thing. I'm up here, I'm going to fix you. And I think one of the reasons that many doors have been opened to our work in the first responder communities, because we make it really clear that our baseline is seeing people as innately resilient, and we're just bringing skills. We're bringing skills. And I love the way you kind of, I don't know, it's not just demystify, but uh, you pull the whole thing out of the closet in some way, because you're taught your emphasis on data and science, that this is just what's smart. These are smart behaviors, right? I'm in a profession that has risks, and the smart way to be in this is to be preventative and to get the support I need. And, you know, there are many professions where people do this. If you think of high performance athletes, they got 15 different coaches, and they got a nutritionist, and they're getting all the help they can to perform at that level, right? Or you think of a race car driver, high risk profession. Well, they're doing all the preventive stuff to do that as safely as they can, right? So it's just that idea of being smart about whatever we're doing, and that gets it out of this whole other kind of in the closet stuff. And I also heard what you said about, you know, you were, I think, a couple times you're saying, I know those are fighting words, you know, and I realized because of the culture. Um, but it's understandable, you know, we ask so much and expect so much of our first responders, and we haven't given them this knowledge and skills you're talking about, at least previous to now. And then we're so critical at the same time. You know, we're the first ones to blame and criticize, you know, and I think probably many first responders feel they're in a no-win situation, right? Which is, you know, going to cause. So I just think I just hope, you know, that you're able to bring that message further and further into the first responder community. And there does seem to be an openness now. There seems to be more openness than ever. I know in corrections there's a big openness. I've been at the last two American Correctional Association conferences and presented on mindfulness and resiliency, and there seems to be a really strong interest. I'd like to go back to your work for a moment in Hillsborough, Oregon, as a police officer, and then becoming a police lieutenant in there. And what's your understanding about that community and the role of the police and other first responders in Hillsborough being a more resilient community or a less resilient community, which affects everybody from kids in schools to the elderly, to if there is any kind of a disaster or problems, you know, what makes for a resilient community, and what part do first responders play in that?
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting, but specifically to talk about the work that I did with Hillsborough Police in roughly, I think 2012, 2013, 2014 were the peak years of training and researching mindfulness. We probably trained, formally we trained about 60 police officers, which was, at that time, was about a little over half of the number of officers in the city. And we got really good data, you know, so our data showed that we were improving, we're improving the ability of officer to sleep well. We're improving their ability to work with physical pain and discomfort. We're improving compassion and empathy. We're reducing reactivity. We're reducing anger and aggression. So those are some of the data points we got that we really were very pleased with. And then continued research in the Portland metro area. So beyond the city of Hillsborough, where I was working as a police lieutenant, we did a randomized control trial and got very similar data. We also took some salivary cortisol samples from officers who were participating in training, and we found that we saw a trend in a reduction in cortisol levels, which is really critically important, especially if you look at the other data around what cortisol does to us when it's dysregulated, causes inflammation and disease and such. So I was able to come in a burst and do some really interesting things with my city, and then the toxic world of policing emerged. I think I look back in my career, Fleet, and I think there's things I would do differently. However, I was pretty driven to create change and to demonstrate that mindfulness would work, and we did that. And then probably the last 7 years or so of my career were really full of a lot of conflict, probably much of which I created, honestly, yet also as a result of the system not wanting change. And because just simply the message of trained mindfulness 10 years ago was insanity inside of policing. I mean, police culture was not ready for it. In fact, it was so not ready for it that there were just such hostility towards me and personally, and towards the message that I would take. So it was a fascinating journey. But so I just wanted to be frank and vulnerable and transparent about that. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you go back to the police department now, you're not going to see a plaque on the wall of, hey, we're really appreciative of Lieutenant Goerling for bringing mindfulness here. It's just not going to happen. Now, interpersonally, where it really matters, I stay connected with a number of police officers in that organization who regularly practice mindfulness meditation, and in one way or another tell me that it's brought them transformation. And so to me, that's all that matters. So I'm absolutely confident that mindfulness meditation is personally transformational. So let's look at community resiliency. For a first responder to be able to show up to the community and to actually see and hear individuals they interact with, they have got to have a grounded foundation of their own skill in attention and compassion. And routinely what we see with first responders who are trauma exposed, probably trauma injured, is a numbing. We still show up. And this is the beautiful thing. So there's resiliency in just still showing up, but I just don't have the emotional or cognitive or physical bandwidth to really care about what you're going to tell me, Fleet, but I'm going to do my job. I'm going to try. I'm going to show up, right? And I think that foundation that lies in this thing called resiliency, this whole person resiliency, is missing in so many communities. And what we're doing, what you're doing, what so many others are doing by trying to penetrate those systemic trauma injuries and get to the individual first responder and help them to see them, help them to sit with their exposure to trauma, and to sit with their maladaptive choices, the habits they've learned over time, which don't serve them well. It's a really, really tough thing to do. But when we do that, we begin to see new possibilities for how that first responder can show up in the world. Okay, I'll talk like a nerd for a minute. Take in data, listen, observe, right? And actually show up with the kind of humanitarian warrior ethos that is in fact going to serve them and going to serve their community. And so as we talk about cultivating community resilience, we are all in this together. And one focus is training first responders in mindfulness to allow them to move into recovery and healing, but more importantly, to allow them to come from a whole new place to see their community, to experience, to encounter, to interact with the people in their community, to notice things like, oh, I'm uncomfortable when I'm talking to this person who's not telling me their gender because I have a form to fill out, right? This is a silly example, but it's like, I don't understand. What do you mean, you're gender fluid? How do I fill this form out, right? And we move to this judgment around that, where it's like, well, just tell me male or female, which is it, right? And in reality, that's not where this person lives, right? And so to be able to go, okay, this makes me uncomfortable, but it's cool. I'm going to notice the judgment that's emerging, and I'm going to bring some compassion to this and be like, okay, yeah, I got a form to fill out, but whatever. I'm going to skip that part of it, right? and let's continue the conversation. Now, that's a
Bring,
silly
bring
example.
some compassion to yourself and to the other person.
Exactly, exactly. But what happens with maladaptive trauma exposure is judgment, because
Hmm.
judgment keeps me safe,
Right.
right? Because I don't need to invest, I don't have the emotional and the cognitive energy bandwidth to engage with this person and learn more about them. Now I'm just like, now when you and I go back to the precinct and we talk, I'm like, you catch that kid who couldn't tell me his freaking gender because I couldn't fill a form out? What's the world coming to today? And we have these conversations where we're just critical of everybody who's not like us. And it's not because I woke up in the morning that day and said, everybody better be like me, and I'm going to go out and be critical of the whole world. It's because I'm trauma exposed. I'm probably trauma injured, and I'm not willing or capable or resourced to be able to address that. And so as a result,
I'm not sure how to
I'm dampened, and I don't have the ability to actually connect with my community in ways that would serve me well. I mean, selfishly would serve me well and would serve others well.
Hmm. One of the reasons I'm interested in exploring this, because it's so important that we bring these skills and this knowledge to first responders so they can take better care of themselves and be resilient. And then, as you're saying, being able to connect with the community when they're doing their work, so so that's a positive, mutually co-regulating, resilient relationship with the community, and then the community can see them in a different way, right? The community sees law enforcement, first responders in a different way, and because I think the way things are can be very isolating, and cops tend to hang out with cops, and it just becomes an isolated culture, right? And one of the reasons I'm really concerned about this is here we are in the midst of this pandemic, and fortunately, it seems like one of the encouraging things, I'm not so sure that every element of our government's done such a great job, but it seems like people are doing pretty well, and people are being pretty cooperative for the most part, and you're seeing some positive things in humanity here, but things could get worse. And what we know is probably headed our way from all the disruptions that could come our way with climate change. And there are things that we'll be facing that if we don't have resilient communities, resilient infrastructure, resilient first responders, and good relationships, we could be seeing a lot of chaos and a lot of terrible stuff. And so it seems like it's really the time to invest in our frontline healthcare workers, our first responders, to build more, because we've been running on empty emotionally, trying to just grow the economy as big as we can, and everybody get as much as they can under this kind of profit thing and growth. And there's some good things in that, but there's a lot of damage. But as a result, we're all kind of running on empty, and we're not reinvesting in this. And I hear all over the country that many law enforcement agencies can't keep their ranks filled, and it's true in corrections as well, because the profession is becoming known for the occupational hazards and injuries and negative culture. It's less attractive, and it may be a good job with good pay, but it's getting less attractive. And so people are doing mandatory overtime, which exacerbates the chronic stress and trauma. And it's a cycle going in the wrong way. And we got to be able to turn this thing around because without a resilient first responder community, we're just a hair's breadth away from really serious chaos.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty reasonable assessment of of the possibilities. We definitely have an opportunity here with this pandemic to really focus on some good evidence-based strategies on cultivating resilience. And really, it's an opportunity for a really critical look at our first responder cultures, but more importantly, our first responder systems. And, the systems continue to support this maladaptive culture. And, until we are willing to really look at the heart of the issue with first responder resilience, I don't know that we're going to get a whole lot of outcomes that we're really striving for. There's a huge movement right now, and it's legislated at the federal level to look at police officer wellness as an example. And unfortunately, so much of the police officer wellness interventions that are being proposed and talked about are, I joke and say, well, the 70s and 80s called and they want our tube socks. tube socks back, because we're still looking at, how fast can you run, how many push-ups can you do, and also, and then we're reinforcing systems we've created that move into this fixed mindset. And so instead of training this first responder to believe that trauma is something they experience rather than trauma is something that happens to them, we're continuing to foster where we've been, and we're going to go where we've been, as opposed to going somewhere new. And that's the frustrating part, I think, as we look at systems. But systems by their nature are that way, right? So there's no villain sitting at the top of the system. There's no villain, senior police leaders, senior fire leaders, senior leaders in emergency medicine. There are no villains, right? And police culture wants to vilify everybody, there are no villains. However, we're perhaps not looking at how science and wisdom, and this is the confluence of science and wisdom, is this thing called mindfulness, and how science and wisdom can inform the leadership choices we make to resource our people. And I think it's less interesting to me to create, well, one of the things I see, one of the trends I see now, Fleet, more fighting words, is mandatory psychological evaluations. And we're calling it mandatory mental health checks, which on some level, I get it, but instead of convincing first responders and shifting the culture that, hey, you see a mental health coach through your employment benefits as a preventative or preventive measure, as well as in response to an injury, it's just what you do. Now we're saying, I don't trust you to do that, Fleet. We're going to make you do it once a year, as if once a year is going to be helpful. And I realize I'm being critical, but instead of looking at data and what it says about psychotherapy, we're forcing people into things, and just similarly forcing people into mindfulness meditation. Not a good idea.
No.
You offer it, you frame it, and at some point people will try it out or they won't, and that's okay too. And so these mandates of, I know what's good for you, I mean, we know as a society that doesn't work so well. I mean, we're struggling with that with the pandemic in certain parts of the country, right? And again, how we have conversations and how we treat each other with the kind of really respect, or maybe more broadly, the kind of equanimity that we all deserve as humans on this planet. We need to bring that to the conversation around resilience as well.
Well, I love what you said about, I mean, I love, you're really bringing forward a mindset that's grounded in data, grounded in science, grounded in training and mindfulness and compassion. And what you said about there are no villains. And I just think that's so important, because really everything we deal with, it's the human condition. And I often say that the human condition unexamined is a prescription for a fear and survival based life, because our biology is set up to survive. So what do we pay most attention to? Threat. And what goes into our long-term memory, our implicit memory, negativity and threat and danger. So that's just the landscape we all begin in. But there's collective human wisdom that says we can train ourselves to move beyond that and to not be trapped in that fear and survival based mindset. And we can actually learn to thrive in the face of adversity. We can get into a growth mindset, even post-traumatic growth. And it's really just about training. It's about knowledge, training, and skills. And one of the wonderful things, I mean, sometimes people who come from deep contemplative traditions worry that the mindfulness movement is, kind of Dharma light or something like that. And I've never felt that way, because I've just been so ecstatic that it's moving into the mainstream of our culture. And this interface between traditional mindfulness training, traditional compassion training, and science is really just opening the door to the possibility, I think, of evolving into a science-based culture. And I don't mean in terms of a highly technological culture, but a culture that's based on what really works, both coming from the traditional yogic sciences of the East of the last, several thousand years, as well as current neuroscience, that we know what works. And we just have to really begin to spread that knowledge.
Yeah, no, beautifully said, Fleet. I love that. And I love your statement around the examination of the life. And I think the examination of the self is a warrior journey.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have observed is when I can get these men and women who have resistance to that examination, because we don't want to sit still and we don't want to notice what we're experiencing in that moment. We want to run away from it. But when we keep coming back to the cushion. We keep coming back to the practice of sitting meditation. And what I see happen is these men and women who are warriors begin to explore themselves. And again, it's transformational. It opens up all kinds of possibilities for how they experience things, how they view themselves, how they have conversations with themselves, right? And it's through that examination that we get to resilience. And I'm not sure that I think we can get to some resilience without that examination, but we cannot really fully become resilient as individuals or as societies without some kind of skillful examination. And I'm sure there's other skills we could train, around awareness and compassion. Mindfulness meditation is, as far as I'm concerned, what I've seen with the evidence in my own experience, it's one of the most efficacious and accessible ways to teach people how to examine.
Yeah, well, it certainly has been in my life. And, again, there's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with humanity. There are no villains. It's just,
Right.
it's our biology. It sets us up to go one way unless we train ourselves. But it's that same human condition. It's a platform for the most profound states of awakening and accessing all our innate capacities for altruism, compassion, and kindness and courage and all the rest of it. So it's just really a question of making the self-empowering choice to engage in that kind of training and reflection. And even a societal level, when we have these tragedies and, these terrible school shootings and then police shootings and the first thing society looks at, who can we blame? Instead of self-reflecting as a society and say, when these things happen, that's society, the system is speaking. It's just like when you're driving your car, you start hearing noises. The car is telling you need to pay attention to the car and get into the shop and take care of it or change the oil or something. But instead of paying attention to that when we have these tragedies, we just let's blame somebody and put it over here. Instead of going, what's actually going on with us as a society that we need to look at, right? And could we get more self-reflective as a society and just start bringing more care and attention, mindfulness and compassion to the whole thing? And so this has been a very powerful conversation. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, after 9/11, I think that was one place where people had a window into the courage and also the impact on first responders. And I think there was a lot of empathy and compassion for all those first responders that risked their lives and lost their lives and have dealt with chronic illnesses since as a result of the chemical exposures and stuff they had there. And so I think there was a window of compassion and understanding. And, hopefully with this pandemic, we'll all awaken to our need to support all of our frontline professionals and our first responders and support ourselves, and that we're all in this together and we're going to have to become more resilient together.
Yeah, very well stated, Fleet. It's been great to chat with you here, and I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
I really appreciate you, and I feel like this is going to give our audience into a much deeper window into all these wonderful professionals who do their jobs every day, even when they're at their worst in terms of their maladaptive coping skills. They're still out there keeping us safe, and I hope we're all going to develop a better understanding from this. So thank you very much.
One more thing, if I could add, if we look at the performance of our first responders today, knowing what we know about what I refer to as the landscape of suffering, knowing what the data tells us is that we are not a healthy body of people, physically healthy, mentally healthy. And you look at the performance. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but these first responders are showing up and performing very well.
Absolutely.
And I would just say, imagine the possibility here.
Mm-hmm.
If we resource them with skills of self-awareness, self-compassion, which moves them to recovery and healing and growth, imagine the possibilities of how they're able to show up.
Yeah.
There's so much more that we can contribute through practices like mindfulness, through other kinds of resilience interventions that allow us to move into our community and really be present and skillful for our communities.
Well said. Thank you. And that's a great vision to end on. It's being able to imagine that possibility, because, we basically know what we need to do to create a beautiful human society. We just kind of have to start doing the work, right? And spread that knowledge around. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.